Hey everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7 in Psych 4100 Cognitive Psychology. In this chapter, we're going to be expanding upon our discussion of long term memory, specifically the sort of processes or the variables that are going to impact encoding, retrieval, and consolidation of long term memories. So, we're moving beyond just the structure of long-term memory, and what we're trying to understand are the things that determine whether a an event or a piece of information will or will not be remembered. So some questions that we will hope to be able to consider after this chapter. What's the best way to store information in long-term memory? What are some techniques we can use to get information out of long-term memory when we need it, to retrieve it? How is it possible that we can actually store this incredibly robust and large lifetime of experiences using just neurons, right? Everything that happens in your brain is just some neurons talking to each other with neurotransmitters. How does that work? The short answer is we're not exactly sure. There's still a lot that we have to learn, but we have some idea about how your neurons sort of work together to create these memories and experiences. And then how can we actually use memory research to inform your day-to-day, everyday study techniques, at work and school? How can you use this information that we find from these studies to actually impact your everyday life? Okay, so again, we're discussing these processes of memory, encoding and retrieval. So, encoding is taking information and putting it into long term memory, right? Creating a memory, if you will. Retrieval is reaching back into that storehouse and bringing the information back into mind. We've already discussed maintenance rehearsal in short term memory. This is the phone number you're trying to remember, and so you repeat it in your head, or maybe the door code to get into your friend's house. They tell you the code, and you just repeat it, so that you can maintain that data, that information in mind, and then use it to open the door or place the phone call. So, in general, this kind of maintenance rehearsal doesn't do a good job of encoding or transferring information into long-term memory. Think about, you pull up into a driveway, your friend gives you their gate code or their door code, and you're repeating it in your head as you run up the driveway. You put it in the door. As soon as the door opens, what do? You forget that information, right? You don't need it anymore. So you stop rehearsing it, you stop maintaining it, and it just goes away. Odds are, if I asked you a week later, hey, what's your friend's door code? You'd have no idea, because this maintenance rehearsal is very surface level and it's very momentary. It doesn't do a good job of getting information into long term memory. However, if we engage in something known as elaborative rehearsal, then we have a much better chance of transferring that information into long term memory. And what we mean by elaborative rehearsal, you also see this called deep processing. So, shallow processing is just repeating the information in your head or focusing on things like its physical features. You're not paying attention to its meaning, right? So if your friend's door code is, 51823, you're just going 51823, 51823, 51823, 51823. You're just repeating the sounds, right? The physical features of that information. Versus depth of processing, which would be repeating that information with the intent of applying meaning to it. 51823. So maybe you say, okay, 51 was my the my jersey number when I played Little League baseball, right? 51 823. Oh, 823 is my aunt's area code in Seattle or whatever, right? So 51823. Okay, Little League baseball number, aunt's area code. Like you try to remember the information by applying some deeper meaning to it. You're relating it to other information, maybe to other memories even. And this elaboration on the gate code 51823 is going to actually enable you to remember it long term. That information, 51823, now has a much better chance of being encoded and stored as a long-term memory, because what you've done is created connections to other bits of information, your Little League jersey number and your aunt's area code. And so instead of just repeating 51823, 51823, which would be shallow processing, if you engage in depth of processing or deep processing, then you're much better able to remember that information. And so, of course, we have an experiment that shows this, and we can see that people who focused on shallow processing, like does the word have capital letters, they had very poor recall. Sort of in between, some people focused on whether a word rhymed or not with another word. They had a little bit better recall. And then our third group required people to answer a question, like a fill in the blank question, using a memory target, a word that they're supposed to remember. And if you have to answer a question about a word, then what you're doing is you're thinking about it, you're encoding it at a deeper level of processing, and we can see memory was more successful, recall was more successful. So focusing on the physical nature of the word, whether it has capital letters, gave you poor performance. Something like rhyming is sort of in between. Rhyming is like a little bit of meaning, kind of. It's more meaningful than whether it has capital letters or not. But the best way to remember something is to actually use it in a sentence, answer a question about it, right? Encode it at a deeper, more meaningful level. There are other factors that can impact encoding of information, and they sort of bounce around between a couple different sort of types. We have depth of processing, which would be like self-reference effect. So refer it to yourself. It creates deeper processing, relating it to, interestingly, survival value. So how relevant is this word to your survival? Right. So water, food are very relevant to survival. Pillows, things like that are not relevant to survival. So if we rate items on their survival relevance, we're better able to remember them. That's sort of depth of processing as well. And then you have things like visual imagery. So over here on the right, we have two examples. People were given word pairs. So the pair of words boat and tree. And there was a group who was instructed just to repeat boat tree, boat tree, boat tree, boat tree, boat tree, right? And then, lots of these pairs, right? So boat tree, then, cat table, and then lamp apple, right? Whatever. Lots of these pairs of words. They're just repeating them over and over and over again. And recall is pretty poor. But if you were in the group that was instructed to visually imagine the words together, so boat tree, you could imagine a boat sitting in a tree. This visual imagery actually increases memory ability and recall. So there's lots of factors that can actually help you encode information. The main idea, the gist here, is that the more you elaborate on information, now, and remember, elaborate doesn't mean repeat. Elaborate means depth of processing. Engage with it in a meaningful way. Visualize it. Relate it to yourself. Relate it to other pieces of information. This depth is going to help you encode and later remember information versus shallow processing, like just repeating it. Another example of how the way we organize information can have an impact on our ability to encode it comes from this really interesting experiment in 1972 where Bransford and Johnson gave people kind of like weird information to remember. It just kind of off the wall, funky, weird stuff that you wouldn't typically encounter. Group one was given an image, a picture that helped explain that information prior to reading the information. So they saw a visual of this sort of weird, quirky, funky situation. Group two saw the picture after reading the passage, and group three never saw a picture. Interestingly, group one outperformed all the other groups, the idea being that the image they were shown prior to reading the passage, the image allowed them to organize and comprehend the information prior to accessing the information or being exposed to the information. And that organizational framework helped them remember. So, for example, someone might have read a passage about a young man that had broken up with his girlfriend, and now he wants her back, and so he decides to serenade her, but she lives on the 20th floor of a building, so he has to get a speaker and balloons and use the speaker and balloons to play music to her. Like, it's kind of a weird situation, but if you saw this image, then suddenly you have a framework, right? You have an organizational unit within which to remember this information. You have a structure that you can apply to it, not a physical structure, so to speak, but a conceptual structure. You're like, oh, okay, suddenly with this visual, it makes more sense, right? He plugged into the wall, he put the balloons on the speaker, he floated the balloons up so that he could play her music, whatever, right? It's a weird sort of nonsensical situation if you just read the words, but if you see this image, you go, oh, okay, I got it, right? I understand it now. It makes more sense. And so that's the idea behind this experiment, is that if you were shown this image prior to the passage makes a lot more sense. The information is suddenly better organized because you have this conceptual framework within which to understand it and organize it. But if you don't see the image, or if you see the image after you read the passage, it's more difficult to organize and comprehend the information. Another interesting effect on encoding information is called the retrieval practice effect. You'll often see this called as well the testing effect. I actually kind of prefer that name for it because it's I think makes it a little more obvious how it can help you in your real life. And this, if we can stop for a second, is one of the things that I would wholeheartedly recommend you do when studying, not just for this course, but for any course in your academic career. This experiment shows us maybe the most effective way or strategy that we know of to help yourself remember information in the real world. And basically, it's to test yourself. And testing is different from studying. So when you study for an exam, studying is technically just maybe reading the information. You read a definition, you read about a study, you read about an example, you read the textbook, you watch the lectures again, you're simply sort of passively taking in the information. That's studying. Testing, or retrieval practice, requires you to think about and then retrieve the information from your own memories. So this would be like doing a practice test, right? Or generating your own practice questions, or making flashcards, and then you see a word and you have to generate its definition, or you see a definition and you have to generate the term, right? You have to actually go back into your brain, into your mind, into your memory systems, and retrieve the tested information. That act of retrieval, rather than just passively reading the information in front of you, the act of retrieval actually helps solidify the memory. And so we see that groups 1 and 2 in this example, who engaged in testing of all words, they actually have much better performance than group 3 that studied all words but only tested words that they missed. So there's a lot of information here. The thing to really focus on is that groups 1 and 2 engaged in testing primarily, and their memory, their correct level of memory was 81% after a week. And group 3 engaged in more studying but less testing, and they had much worse performance. So testing led to good performance, studying led to bad performance. So as you're studying for an exam, make sure that your studying also includes a substantial amount of self-testing. Retrieval practice is what we call that. Okay, so let's now, we've been talking about encoding. Let's shift gears a little bit and consider the factors that help us retrieve information. It's generally thought that most failures of memory are failures of retrieval, meaning the information exists in long-term memory, but we're having a difficult time getting it out. This seems odd, and if it's in there, why can't you find it? Why can't your brain find the information that it has stored? And I have actually a great example of retrieval failures that we have all experienced, and it's tip of the tongue. This often happens with things like most people experience this with names of actors or names of musicians or titles of movies or song lyrics or song titles, and you know that you know the information. Like, I know that when I see a picture of an actor, and I'm like, oh, I know who that is. They were in this movie. They were in that movie. I love them so much. They were married to this person. Why can't I think of this person's name? Oh my gosh, it's on the tip of my tongue. Right? I know it. It's in my brain. I just can't retrieve it. And then suddenly, oh, Nicolas Cage, right? It just, boom, it pops out of nowhere because your brain finally retrieved the information. So what you were experiencing is, in the world of memory research, is actually what's called a feeling of knowing. Tip of the tongue is an event in which you have a high feeling of knowing, like, I know who that is, I know their name, I know that I know it, I just can't get it out of my brain right now. You have a high feeling of knowing, but a failure of retrieval of the information. That's the definition of tip of the tongue. And people actually use tip of the tongue to study memory retrieval. It's a really, really interesting area of study where researchers induce tip of the tongue in people in the lab. They create situations of tip of the tongue, and then they study the experience. So we know that when we're retrieving information, any types of cue called cued recall is going to enhance our retrieval. So again, if you're trying to remember the name Nicolas Cage, right, the actor, it would help you retrieve his name if I said, oh yeah, he was in Gone in 60 Seconds. He was in the National Treasure movies, right? You'd suddenly go like, oh yeah, I remember those. Nicolas Cage, right? Boom. The cue helps you recall the information. And so if we provide better and better cues, or more and more cues, or more meaningful cues, then retrieval is increased. We're more successful. Another really interesting effect about experiment that shows an effect on retrieval is called encoding specificity. And so, I said it's about retrieval, but why is it called encoding specificity? It's basically about the matching of encoding with retrieval situations. So if the scenario, if the situation, literally sometimes the world around you, if the world around you matches between encoding and retrieval, you're better capable of remembering the information. So, for example, when you study for this course, or when you listen to these lectures or read the book, you should do so perhaps in the exact same room every time. So your situation, the world around you at encoding is always the same. You're in the same room. And then when you go to take the exams in this class, when you go to retrieve the information, you should make sure to be back in that same room, such that the specific factors, the specific world variables, right, the room around you, the time of day, even, that information was encoded at specifically matches the situation of retrieval. And if that happens, if retrieval matches encoding, then retrieval is better. So the first really famous experiment to show this used 3 examples of sort of situations, scenarios. The first and the most dramatic, I think the most probably interesting, is whether people studied or remembered information underwater or on land. So, literally, what these researchers did is they took a group of people and they split them in half. And they said, okay, half of you are going to go into the swimming pool. We're going to give you scuba gear. You're going to go down to the bottom of the swimming pool and you're going to study these words, right? So we have underwater study. They're literally sitting at the bottom of a swimming pool with a special underwater paper in scuba gear studying words. The other half of the people studied just on dry land, right? Just in a classroom, whatever. So then at test, so we're going to now test you for your memory of those words. They took the underwater group, they split them in half again. Half of them tested back underwater. They were asked to recall the information underwater again in the same scenario as encoding, or they were asked to recall information on land in a different situation. The same thing happened for the people that remembered or that studied on land. They either had to recall underwater or they had to recall on land. And here these numbers are performance. And you can see that when testing matched studying, so underwater, performance was better than when testing did not match studying on land versus underwater. We can see the same thing over here on the right. On land studying with on land testing was really good performance. On land studying with underwater testing was poor performance. This experiment has been repeated with whether an environment was noisy or quiet, and then even someone's mood, whether you were happy or sad at studying and test. Interestingly, this last one has some pretty important implications for things like depression, because what this means is that if you're currently in a depressed state, it's actually easier for you to remember other things that happened when you were depressed or when you were sad. So it's easier to remember other depressing stuff when you're depressed. This can lead to a sort of cycle, a spiral of negative or depressing thoughts, and which is one of the hallmarks of depression. And part of that might actually be due to this very sort of strange effect on memory that we call encoding specificity. This is related to something maybe a little bit more specific called state-dependent learning. We tend to think of encoding specificity really as being the matching of the outside world. So underwater versus on land, and noisy versus quiet. Encoding specificity is about the outside world. State dependent learning is about internal states. So that would be the mood one, the sadness versus happiness. There's also been some work here done on altered states. So, for example, whether you were drinking alcohol at encoding and either drinking or not drinking alcohol at retrieval, whether you were high on THC at encoding and then high or not high on THC at retrieval, and you actually get some similar effects. You get this similarity effect, such that if you're drinking at retrieval, you're better able to remember information if you were drinking at encoding. Our next example of a factor that impacts the successfulness of retrieval is called transfer appropriate processing. That's a super big, long, fancy name for basically saying if you're doing a similar task at retrieval as you were at encoding, memory is better. That's it. If you're doing a similar task, so it's perfectly analogous to encoding specificity, state dependent learning. Basically, if you learned words based on rhyming them, then you're better able to retrieve them if you rhymed them. Versus if you learned words based on their meaning and then you try to retrieve them based on rhyming, your performance goes down. Transfer appropriate processing. Again, big fancy term for basically saying if you're doing some shit at encoding, make sure you do the same shit at retrieval and your performance will be better. So if you match rhyming with rhyming, your performance is good. If you mix and match, right, if you do a meaning based task and then a rhyming task for retrieval, your performance goes down. Okay, so that's basically encoding and retrieval. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about consolidation. This is really a biologically based process in the brain, in the way that your neurons interact with one another to consolidate, or what you might call solidify, these memories. Basically, take memories that are in a fragile physiological state and turn them into a more permanent state. We can think of two types of consolidation occurring: synaptic consolidation, which is very fast and very rapid and occurs at the level of the connection between two individual neurons, or at the synapse, right, where one neuron talks to the next neuron. Synaptic consolidation is the sort of the strength of connection, or the strength of firing between two neurons. Systems consolidation is a little bit of a broader idea. It's a larger scale, and it has to do with the reorganization of large scale neural connections across the brain. So synaptic consolidation is like one neuron talking to another neuron and like strengthening that connection between neuron A and neuron B. Systems consolidation is the sort of web of connections across the brain. It's a little slower, it's more gradual, and it's about reorganizing this large web of connections in order to solidify a memory. So, again, here's just like a little visual. Synaptic consolidation is just one neuron talking to another neuron and really strengthening the level of connection between those two neurons. Systems consolidation is about these sort of disparate neurons that might be very far away from each other, coordinating their discussions with one another, coordinating their activity over time. One thing we know about consolidation is that it takes time. I mean, literally, this process is about your neurons engaging with one another on a biological level. That doesn't happen immediately. It happens quickly, right? Your neurons are fast. Your brain is super, super quick, but it takes time, right? There's a lag. There's a delay there of physiology, right? There's a biological time constraint to the activity of your brain and neurons. And so what we find is that consolidation requires at least some amount of time, such that if we give people two lists of information, so you get, I don't remember exactly how many words were in this experiment, but let's say that list one is 30 words that you have to remember, right? Here's a list, try and remember it. And then you immediately get a second list of 30 words. So 30 words, and then boom, right away, oop, here's another list of 30 words. Okay, then we wait some amount of time. We have a delay of maybe 30 minutes or an hour. And then we test for list one, the original list. Performance is terrible. It's really bad. You only remember 28% of those words. Versus, again, the exact same words, the exact same lists, except instead of immediately giving you list two, there's a delay, a 5 or 6 minute delay between getting the 30 words in list one and the 30 words in list two. Just this little delay almost doubles performance for recall of list one at a later time. What's happening? In this 6 minute delay, your neurons are talking to each other. That's it. That's what's happening. This 6 minute delay gives your neurons time to do this, to coordinate with one another. And with that coordination, we get better long-term memory. So what this tells you from a practical perspective is that if you study something, you should then walk away, take a 5-minute break before you come back to study again. So I want you to imagine you're studying for an exam in this class. What you should do is you should study a section of a chapter and then take a 5-minute break, and then study the next section, and then take a 5-minute break, and then study the next section, and then take a 5-minute break. Because these 5-minute breaks between sections of the textbook are going to allow your brain the time to consolidate those memories, and you will have better performance. So one of the really important ideas to come out of the sort of early work on synaptic consolidation was called long-term potentiation, LTP. And this is basically enhanced firing of neurons after repeated stimulation. Basically, neurons that fire together become more strongly connected. So if you repeatedly stimulate certain neurons, then they become enhanced in their ability to fire together. You get structural changes in those neurons that allow for enhanced responding. So maybe the first time you hear a piece of information, these two neurons are sort of talking to each other. These two neurons are responsible for your memory of that information, and they have some connection, right? There's some response between these two neurons. You continue to present the stimulus or the information, and the responding gets stronger. If you continue to present that stimulus again at a later time, then we get even more responding. Think about this. The best analogy that I can come up with is physically working out, right? The first time you do bicep curls, it sucks. It's hard. Your biceps are weak. They're not strong, right? There's not a whole lot of connection there, so to speak. But you do bicep curls for a couple weeks and you notice that, your biceps are getting stronger. You're looking pretty good. And then you do bicep curls for 6 months, and all of a sudden you've got these nice, big, toned, responsive biceps that are strong. That's the analogy here, that your synapses firing together are basically working out and strengthening in connection. So that's long-term potentiation. That's the functioning of sort of at the individual level of neuron to neuron. But then, as we said before, we can also discuss the systems level of consolidation. So, how do different brain areas talk to one another in order to develop long-term memories? Originally, we thought that the hippocampus, which is this sort of red structure here, originally we thought the hippocampus is really, really important at the encoding of information. So the first time information comes in, the hippocampus is really directing and coordinating this system level activity. And then the hippocampus's involvement in that coordination fades over time, such that the connection between the hippocampus and that information in the brain goes away eventually, and the only connections that remain are these cortical connections, these what you might call intercortical connections, the connections between different areas of the cortex. So originally we thought the hippocampus helps create the memories, and then over time the impact of the hippocampus fades, and eventually all that matters is the cortical connections. That's the standard model of consolidation. It was based on some evidence we had from trauma and injury and memory loss, basically amnesia. We've all sort of heard that word. Amnesia is memory loss, but there are actually different types of memory loss. There's retrograde amnesia, which is loss of information prior to the injury or the trauma. And then we have this idea of graded amnesia, such that more recent events are actually more subject to retrograde amnesia than remote events. What does that mean? Okay, let's look at an example. So I'll use myself as an example here. When I was in 10th grade, I had a concussion that I got during wrestling practice in high school. I got thrown. We were just practicing, and so half of the wrestling team was practicing how to throw someone. The other half of the wrestling team was being the dummy. You're just letting yourself be thrown so that your partner can learn the move. So I was being the dummy. I was just sitting there letting someone practice on me and throw me. And I got thrown into another person. My head, the front of my head, got thrown into their knee. I blacked out for a minute. I had not a severe, but a pretty substantial concussion. It was sort of a moderate concussion. And that was the moment of my injury. That's this arrow, is Dr. Sellers receiving a concussion in 10th grade at wrestling practice. Boom, right there. This is when it happened in time. Now, what actually ended up happening is that I forgot what happened that day at school. I lost my memory for the previous day. So wrestling practice is happening at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. after school. I had retrograde amnesia, and I couldn't remember anything from the previous day. Couldn't remember it. But I could remember, something that happened a month ago or 6 months ago or a year ago or 5 years ago, right? The remote memories were safe because they were already consolidated. They were already hooked up from this hippocampal activity. Those remote memories were already sort of solidified in the cortex. So I could perfectly remember things that happened months ago, but as time got closer to my injury, it became more likely that I would forget it. So we had graded amnesia, such that the more recent memories were more subject to memory loss, were more subject to the retrograde amnesia. The further back in time we went from the injury, the better my memory actually was for those events. And then we also have another type of amnesia called anterograde amnesia. That would be failure to remember things that happen after your injury. So in my case, I had my concussion at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. I went home. I knew that I had a history exam the next day, so I studied. I spent, a couple hours studying for my history test. This would be after the injury, right? So right in here. So if this happened at 5 or 6 p.m., I go home, we have some dinner, maybe from 8 to 10. So after the injury, I study for my history exam. I go in the next day, I take the exam, and I bomb it. I think I got like a 40 or a 45 on the exam because I had amnesia for all of that information I had studied right after my injury. So anterograde amnesia. So I had amnesia for all the information that happened that I encountered after the injury. That's anterograde. Retrograde is amnesia for information before the injury. So this evidence, specifically the graded amnesia evidence, is what we used to basically say, well, once information is consolidated, the hippocampus doesn't really matter that much. That's not so much what we believe anymore. The sort of more modern multiple trace model of consolidation suggests that the hippocampus is actually still active during retrieval of both recent and remote memories. It's just that the response of the hippocampus sort of changes over time. It's still involved, but it changes. So the more modern multiple trace model actually suggests that, yes, the hippocampus is obviously involved in encoding and creating this intercortical memory, but that the connection between the intercortical memory and the hippocampus remains. It might just adjust and change a little bit over time, but that the hippocampus is in fact important for both encoding and retrieval. Interestingly, consolidation appears to be enhanced by sleep. This is occurring for probably many different reasons. Sleep itself is likely important for consolidation. Your brain, we tend to have this idea that when you go to sleep, your brain shuts off or turns off, which is actually not the case. There are many areas of your brain that are in fact more active during sleep than they are while you're awake. Sleep is full of activity in the brain. This is one of the reasons why if you tend to maybe have a nightcap, a drink or a cocktail or a glass of wine right before you go to bed to help you sleep, your sleep tends to be of poorer quality because that alcohol or whatever other substance you're ingesting in the evening is actually depressing your neural activity in your brain during sleep. It is those, alcohol and things like THC are depressants, so they actually force your brain to be less active during sleep, which sounds like a good thing, but it's actually bad. It's actually bad for your brain's health and for memory consolidation. We want that activity. So depressing brain activity by taking some sort of sleep aid or substance might actually lead to worse quality sleep. Interestingly, once memories sort of exist, they can be reconsolidated. So we can sort of, we can, in a way, and we're going to see an example of this, we can sort of mess with memories once they already exist, because memories really are a work in progress. Once a memory exists, your brain is sort of constantly updating it and changing it and shifting it, and reestablishing those connections. And this process of reestablishing consolidated memories can be both good and bad. It means that we can take an old, fragile memory, something that maybe you just kind of barely remember, and by bringing up new information, by forcing you to retrieve it, we can actually reconsolidate it and make it a strong memory. We have some example of this from both rats and humans. However, the downside of this is that we can mess with that information and kind of screw with it. And that reconsolidation can actually create memory errors, because memory is a work in progress. It is not set in stone and established for all of time. One of the, in my opinion, the coolest things that's happened in the last 15 or so years with memory is the idea that we can actually use this reconsolidation process in therapy and treatment for individuals with PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder is essentially an anxiety disorder, a severe anxious emotional response to previous traumatic events or memories. We often hear about PTSD in soldiers, right? People in war who were involved in or saw terrible things, extremely, severely horrible events. You also see PTSD in people who were in terrible car accidents, people who were sexually assaulted or raped. Any sort of severe traumatic experience can cause this sequela of anxiety issues that we call PTSD. PTSD is often associated with these traumatic memories. And there's been some work recently such where we can actually lessen the symptoms of PTSD by reactivating those memories. So we sort of reconsolidate. We ask people to remember the traumatic event, right? So take yourself back to that place, right? When you were in war, when you were in that terrible car accident. What did it feel like? What did it smell like? Who were you with? Right? Reactivate the memory, which is traumatic in and of itself. But if we actually administer a drug that inhibits the amygdala is the emotion center of the brain. It's where these severe emotional responses would sort of originate. So if during the reactivation of the traumatic memory, we administer a drug that blocks the activity of the amygdala, it actually lowers the stress response of PTSD in the future. Because what's happened is that we've reconsolidated the memory, right? We had the patient retrieve this severe emotional memory. And as they're retrieving that memory, we sort of remove the part of the brain, the amygdala, that controls this severe emotional response. We block it. We pharmaceutically block the response of the amygdala. And so when the memory gets reconsolidated by the brain, it leaves out the amygdala. The amygdala has been blocked. So the reconsolidation of the memory no longer includes an emotional stress response. And it actually has been shown in clinical trials to decrease PTSD symptoms, which is incredible. It's amazing, right? And this is going to help tons and tons of people. But it also perhaps shows us something a little scary about memory itself, which is that memories are fragile. Memories can change. Memories can be manipulated, and we know how to do this. And so we can do it for good, right? We can have positive outcomes like helping individuals through their traumatic experiences. But this also opens up an opportunity, perhaps, for some people to do this in a negative way, right? To use this knowledge and this technology to impact people's memories for negative ends, for negative reasons. Okay. So our last slide here. What can we take away from all of this information about encoding, retrieval, and consolidation that will help you remember information better in your day-to-day life, and particularly studying for exams? Well, first, you should elaborate on information, associate it with yourself, associate it with something you've learned before, something you already know, something that's important to you. Elaborate the information. Generate your own questions, make note cards, make your own multiple choice questions, and then test yourself. Take breaks, space out your studying and your learning so that you have time for consolidation of those memories, and sleep. Get sleep. I promise you that in 20 or 30 years, we are going to look back and we are going to identify sleep as a critical component for a long and healthy life. Sleep is implicated in memory. Sleep is implicated in overall health. Sleep is implicated in things like Alzheimer's disease. Please, please, please make sure you're getting 7 at a minimum. 8 is better hours of sleep. I know that's really, really tough. I know that a lot of us get used to existing on 4, 5, or 6 hours because we're so busy, but it really, really is bad for you. And it really does have a negative impact on your ability to create new memories and consolidate them and do well in school. So do everything you can to sleep. And won't go into it too much here, but what the science of sleep tells us is that thankfully naps count. So if you're only able to get 4 or 5 hours a night because of school, family, work, the hectic busyness of life, do your best to get as much as you can, but then find some time for naps. Even a 20-minute, 30-minute, 40-minute nap is going to improve your functioning substantially. So get as much sleep as you can and avoid the illusion of learning, such that you do not want to confuse being familiar with information with actually comprehending and knowing it. This goes back to sort of our testing procedure, the retrieval practice effect. Make sure you can actually retrieve the information from your own memories rather than looking at it on a page or looking at it in a textbook and being familiar with it. Well, that's it for Chapter 7 on long-term memory. Up next is Chapter 8, which is a really interesting set of information on everyday memories and memory errors. We're going to sort of elaborate on a few of the things we've talked about here about the sort of reconstructive nature of memory. And I think that this chapter, Chapter 7, and the next chapter, Chapter 8, are perhaps two of the chapters that are most applicable to your day-to-day life. They're incredibly interesting and have quite robust sort of relationships with things that happen around us in everyday life. So thanks for listening. Pick up with Chapter 8, and I will see you next time.